settled in. Today we'll be talking about the Dragons of Autumn Twilight, the first of the Chronicles trilogy that opened the world to the Dragonlance campaign setting in TSR. Written in 1984 by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, the Dragons of Autumn Twilight was the beginning of not only one of the most beloved series amongst fans of Dungeons and Dragons, but also a collaboration that brought to fans of the fantasy genre tales from richly detailed worlds populated with characters of such depth as rarely realized. And they are the Deathgate Cycle, the Sovereign Stone series, and the Darksword series. As mentioned, the Dragons of Autumn Twilight is the first of a trilogy known as Chronicles set in the world of Krynn, a realm in which the presence and memories of gods had long ago since faded away after an apocalyptic event known as the Cataclysm. The book itself is written in an unusual way. It was first conceived by Tracy Hickman and his wife as an adventure module for TSR, the publisher of D&D. Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weis then ran a tabletop campaign with that module, having a group of friends play a cast of pre-generated characters made for that module. The characters are Tanis Half-Elven, a bastard half-elf; Flint Fireforge, a gruff old dwarf and a friend to Tanis for many years; Sturm Brightblade, a young, melancholic knight of the Solamnic Order; Caramon and Wrestling Major, twins who are as different as night and day; Tasselhoff Barefoot, the comic relief; River Wind and Gold Moon, new to the circle of friends. And I should note here that River Wind was an NPC and only Gold Moon was meant to be played. And the story itself, the book, was written primarily off the back of that campaign with very interesting results. Now on to the story, and our story starts in the tavern. And with
Best story beginning ever. Sorry, my bad. Carry on.
And with the reunion of the companions in the town of Solace after a 5-year absence in which each of them went their separate ways. Here, amidst the mighty Vallenwood trees in which the residents of Solace built their homes, they gathered in the Inn of the Last Home. Much had changed in the 5 years since. Solace was overrun by goblins led by the odious Viewmaster Toady, part of a conquering force known only as the Dragon Army that had swept Krynn with the fires of war. It was led by a dragon high lord known as Verminard. Gone were the welcoming smiles of yesteryears, to be replaced by sullen, suspicious looks as the underlings of Viewmaster Toad turned the village upside down in search of a blue crystal staff. The companions are joined by 2 new faces, as mentioned, River Wind and Gold Moon, who carried with her a staff. The duo are plainsmen of the Kyushu tribe, betrothed to each other and who find themselves on the outskirts of Solace through mysterious and portentous means. Escorted into the village by Sturm, the 2 plainsmen were initially reluctant to trust the companions. Things took a different turn, however, as River Wind and Gold Moon were forced to flee Solace and travel with Tanis and his friends when a brawl in a tavern erupted. An old man, of whom the less is said at the moment, the better, had been telling stories of the old gods to a group of children, in the tavern, which angered the Seeker, a religious group that denounced the old gods while preaching gospels of new ones. The Seeker saw it as blasphemy and in a tussle fell into an inn's hearthfire, burning his hands. At the urging of the dungeon master, the old man, Gold Moon touched...
I mean, it's the Dungeon Master, isn't it?
Gold Moon touched the Seeker's hand, and in a flash of azure light, the Seeker was healed of his wounds. The tavern immediately erupted in chaos. The staff is, of course, the blue crystal staff. The companions escaped the inn with the help of a friend, the barmaid Tika, and made a break for the outskirts of Solace. Weighted down by the conflicts and distrust within the group, the plainsmen with the old friends and everyone else with wrestling, they bounced around in the wilderness while evading pursuit. Eventually, the protagonists found themselves in a haunted forest and were confronted by the specters that guarded it. The blue crystal staff responded to the specters in some mysterious ways and brought the companions safe passage. The restless dead departed, and they were brought before the forest master. The forest master, a unicorn, gave the adventurers succor, at least for the night. She told them that their coming had been expected and foreordained. The quest NPC, the forest master, told them where they had to go next, eastwards, to the ruins of an ancient city known as Saroth, where she told them if they proved worthy, they shall receive the greatest of gifts given to the world. Traveling on the backs of Pegasi, summoned by the forest master, they landed in the plains of Abanasinia, still half a day's journey to Saroth. Here they find the ashes of the Kyushu tribe, Go Moon and River Wind's people, who were destroyed by the dragon army in their search for the blue crystal staff. After grieving for the Kyushu, River Wind led the party through a treacherous swamp into Saroth, where it was revealed to us River Wind first found the blue crystal staff. He did not remember much of his harrowing travails in the ruins of Saroth, other than something he called death on black wings. Now, death on black wings turned out to be a dragon. Creatures long since vanished from Kryn after the cataclysm. Dragons are fearsome creatures of the ancient gods, and when the gods left, they followed. For 300 years, there were no traces of them. And now, here amidst the crumbling walls of an ancient city, this creature of myth and legend burst forth from deep beneath an enormous well where it lay. Quote, sleek and black, the dragon rose, her glistening wings folded close to her sides, her scales gleaming. Her eyes glowed red-black, the color of molten rock. Her mouth opened in a snarl, teeth flashing white and wicked. Her long red tongue curled as she breathed the night air. Clear of the well's confines, the dragon spread her wings, blotting out the stars, obliterating moonlight. Each wing was tipped with a pure white claw that shone blood red in the light of Nulitari. End quote. The companions could not overcome the sorcerous might of the dragon as she casted a spell of darkness over the group so deep that even the dragon herself could not see in it. Then the dragon struck with her most devastating weapon, a breath of highly corrosive acid. River Wind was caught full in the blast, searing his flesh from bone. He screamed. Thinking she had slain the intruders, the dragons retreated into the well, buying the adventurers some measure of reprieve. There was no room for relief, however, for River Wind lay near death, the state of his body a stomach-turning sight. It was at this moment that Gold Moon called to them, bidding them to bring her betrothed's body. She had been called to a temple by some mysterious allure. Inside the temple, while the rest of the companions faced the dragon, one of the old gods had manifested herself to Gold Moon. Mishakal, the goddess of healing, whispered to Gold Moon, telling her of the old faith. She told the plainswoman why the old gods left, of the evil that had returned to Kryn and how they might defeat this evil. Mishakal told Gold Moon of the nature of the greatest gift, which is the truth of the old gods, that they had never turned away from the world, but that the world had turned away from the gods because of their arrogance. Deep inside the ruins of Saroth, in the midst of the dragon's horde, are the discs of Mishakal, holy relics of the goddess. With this, Gold Moon can return true faith and worship of the old gods to the world, and this is how they can push back the tide of evil. Goldmoon was aghast at the sight of Riverwind's condition. Holding back tears, she offered her prayers to Mishalkal, asking the goddess for her mercy and blessing to be bestowed on her beloved Riverwind. The power of Mishalkal flowed through Goldmoon, and before their eyes, Riverwind was healed. The companions had witnessed true healing, a feat none on Kryn had seen since the cataclysm. Boasted by the miracle, the adventurers sallied forth, descending into the depths of Saksarov to find the discs, although many still harbored doubts. Stealing their way into the dragon's lair with the help of Bupu, a female gully dwarf that Wrestlin had befriended, they confronted the black dragon and defeated her with the help of the blue crystal staff. Shattering the staff against the dragon, the power of the goddess slowly engulfed and destroyed the dragon. With the death of the dungeon boss, the boss's lair began to collapse in a trope highly beloved by dungeon masters and authors everywhere. The players did the only things players could do and ran for their tabletop lives. Escaping the city, the adventurers headed for Solace, back to Solace, only to find it in flames. The dragon High Lord Verminat had sent in a flight of dragons to raze the village to the ground, leaving only a few buildings like the Inn of the Last Home standing. Sneaking back into the inn, the companions tried to figure out what to do next. It is here that they encountered Giltanas, an elf from the elven city of Qualinos, Tanis' childhood home. Giltanas is Tanis' adopted brother, whom he grew up with when Giltanas' father, the ruler of Qualinos, adopted him. Their reunion was short-lived, however, as Verminat had a standing order to his army to kill all elves on sight. Giltanas' identity was revealed inadvertently, and the forces of Verminat, led by the Viewmaster Toad, captured the companions. Viewmaster Toad marched the companions to the fortress known as Pax Tarkas to be presented to the Dragon High Lord as slaves. Inside the slave caravan, they meet once again the old man that had started it all during that night of the companions' reunion in the Inn of the Last Home. His name is Fizban, and he turned out to be a wizard of consequence. Unpredictable consequence, that is. Our band of adventurers were freed from captivity when Fizban casted a fireball at the cages they were imprisoned in. The fireball did not destroy their cages, and as a matter of fact, nearly killed them. The ensuing chaos, however, did give the adventurers time to break free. Together with Gilthanas, they fled into the forest and eventually into Quaninesti, home of the elves. Tanis had an uneasy reunion with his adopted father, the Speaker of the Sun, as well as Lorana, his adopted sister, who have had an infatuation with him since they were children, and one of the causes that led to Tanis leaving Qualinesti. The reunion was short-lived, for they discovered that the elves were in the midst of abandoning their homeland. The forces of Verminat threatened to overwhelm them with extinction, and the Speaker had a plan to send his son, Gilthanas, to lead a possibly suicidal mission to Pax Tarkas, where he was to free the slaves held there and lead an uprising, the purpose of which is to distract Verminat's forces and to buy the elves time to evacuate their homeland. The Speaker asked the companions to go with Gilthanas and help him. The adventurers agreed and travelled with Fizban, who insisted on coming, to an elven home called the Sla Mori, which had many forgotten entrances into the fortress. The Sla Mori was not without its dangers, however, and after an encounter with a banshee, Tasselhoff and Fizban were separated from the main group. The rest of the group did manage to sneak into the fortress, where they eventually won the trust of the human captives, and that of a red dragon known as Flamestrike. Flamestrike is an unbelievably old dragon who lost all her children in the ancient war against the legendary Huma, a war from a time going back even further than the cataclysm. Shattered by grief, half mad and half blind, Flamestrike thought the children captured by Verminat in Pax Tarkas to be her own brood. The companions hatched a plan to disguise everyone as women and sneak all the captives out past the senile red dragon. Meanwhile, Tasselhoff and Fizban had, after wandering lost in the old fortress, found themselves in a hidden alcove above Verminat's throne room, where he and his mount, a younger red dragon known as Amber, received the groveling Viewmaster Toad as he tried to explain away the escaped prisoners. Tasselhoff spent his time over the next few days looking for a way out of the place they had found themselves in and rejoin his friends. An unfortunate accident involving Fizzban's hat alerted Verminat and Amber to their presence. Verminat immediately ordered his dragon to seek out and capture the intruders. Tasselhoff and Fizzban fled, running as fast as they could. Amber's great bulk destroyed much of the fortress interior during the chase. In the final moments of their flight, the red dragon burst through the walls of the fortress interior, where Fizzban plummeted to his death. Soaring from the fortress of Pax Tarkas, with Verminat sitting astride, the dragon High Lord found the companions in their attempt to lead the captives out of Pax Tarkas. Furious, the dragon High Lord ordered Amber to slay everyone, including the women and children. As Amber poised to strike, a streak of red swept from the pile of rubble and drove towards Amber. It was Flamestrike. The aging dragon had sunk even deeper into her madness. Once more, she relived the nightmare of losing her children. She saw again as her brood flew to join battle with the forces of good in that final bloody battle. The Knights of Solamnia, sitting astride dragons of gold and silver, wielded the fabled Dragonlances, piercing the bodies of her children, killing them all. Verminat's orders to kill the children ignited a spark in an old soul, and as she had done so many centuries ago, Matafleur flew out to defend her children. Amber was young and strong, and scoured terrible injuries on old Matafleur, well past her prime. Yet her long life lent her a cunning undiminished by her madness, and that very same madness gave her a strength that transcended her aging body. She struck back at Amber, hard, and unseated Verminat in the process. Matafleur's attack on Amber galvanized the companions and captives into collective action. They took up arms against the oppressors, while Sturm, Tanis, Caramon, and Wrestlin took the opportunity presented to them and advanced upon the fallen Dragon High Lord. 4 against 1. It was good odds for the heroes, except for the fact that Verminat is a powerful cleric, himself blessed by one of the true gods, the Queen of Darkness, Tarkisis. Calling on the might of his goddess, Verminat cursed Wrestling with great pain, blinded Caramon when he leapt to his brother's defense and paralyzed Sturm and Tanis. All seemed lost, but Goldmoon placed a hand on Verminat. Verminat stopped in his tracks. Through Verminat, Tarkisis felt a radiance presence flowing from Goldmoon. He was her ancient enemy. Not yet ready to face her nemesis, Tarkisis fled, abandoning her cleric and leaving him to his fate. Without the Queen of Darkness behind him, Verminat was much diminished. The heroes quickly dispatched him. Overhead, Matafleur was dying. Amber had gained the upper hand and was slowly beating her down. He maneuvered to deal Matafleur a death blow, placing himself between the old dragon and the walls of a mountain. The aging red dragon saw her chance, and she charged. Amber breathed a cone of deadly flames right in front of Matafleur, searing her eyes and forever ending her vision. Undeterred, Matafleur flew on, slamming into Amber with all the force she could muster, pinning and crushing him into the mountain face. The mountain exploded in flames, slaying both dragons. Thus, the Battle of Pax Tarkas was won. The story ends with the wedding of Goldmoon and Riverwind. It was time of mourning, as the survivors remembered their dead, but it was also a celebration of deliverance, and the people rejoiced in their salvation. Yet, the threat of evil remains. The Queen of Darkness had lost a minor battle, but her power is undiminished. When she is ready, she will darken the skies of Kryn with her dragons of winter night. The Dragons of Autumn Twilight is a heroic fantasy adventure with very familiar elements, especially to people into the D&D tabletop scene. It uses a lot of the same tropes one would find in the fantasy genre everywhere. Great evil to be overcome, magical, fantastical creatures like Pegasus, unicorns, and dragons. It even has its own homebrew creatures like the Draconians, which I did not go over in the summary because it would make the summary much too long. They are elite foot soldiers of the Dragon Queen's army, and they are an important part of the lore, which reveals itself in later books. It borrows a lot of ideas from the grandfather of all modern fantasy, Tolkien himself. Kandars are the hobbits of Krynn. There are dwarves and elves, and with very similar relationship to each other and to humans. There are even plot elements that are lifted and repackaged from the Lord of the Rings, like the adventurers bouncing around in the wilderness before finding refuge in an elven city, with more of such scenes to be found deeper into the trilogy. It also borrows quite a bit from Christian concepts, such as the restoration of faith. What Mishakal told Goldmoon in that temple in Saroth isn't all that different from the parable of the two sets of footprints, which I think all Christians are familiar with. It is a less gritty type of fantasy than Conan or Game of Thrones. And while there is plenty of action and fighting, it is not as visceral as David Jamal. It is brighter, more hopeful, with plenty of light-hearted moments thrown in, mostly carried by Tasselhoff, Flint, and Fizban. Even though the emotional tone of the trilogy is generally bright, it doesn't focus on just one note, like Berserk, and rather has a wider emotional dynamic range. It swings from dark moments to silly moments to heroic moments, hopeful moments, and everything in between. The trilogy therefore sits closer to a high fantasy, and is in general a comfortable and casual read, and will not throw any wild surprises at readers who are in the mood for lighter reading. This isn't to say that Chronicles is completely generic. What does set Chronicles apart and made it one of my favorite fantasy series even after all these years is firstly that it is embedded with a lot of down-to-earth wisdom. One such example in the book we examined is when Tasselhoff was lost with Fizban in Pax Tarkas. Tasselhoff had an uncharacteristically glum moment when he doubted himself. He wondered if he was of any consequence and whether anything he did mattered. He was not tall and strong like Caramon, a knight like Sturm, a leader like Tennis, or clever like Wrestling. And isn't that true of many of us to some extent? Most of us are just normal people. We are not movers and shakers. Some of us barely lead ourselves most days, much less others. Tasselhoff's father bequeathed him with a bit of wisdom, however. The world is made of small things. Even the very big things are made of many tiny things that prop them up. The big folks will do their big things, but the tiny folks can do their small things. And over time, they add up. Small things do matter in the end. This story also has a very different take on the nature of good and evil. Unlike traditional fantasy where evil is clearly delineated from good, or that good stays good until tempted by sin and vice becoming evil, evil seldom becomes good except through some redemption arc, and evil is always something to be fought against, even if good doesn't always win. Dragons of Autumn Twilight explicitly talks about balance, that good is necessary as evil, and that good can also bring about unspeakable calamity. So evil is necessary? That is surely not a common take in traditional high fantasy stories. Granted, this book was written to sell a D&D adventure module where players can play evil characters, so evil is in fact a necessary part of the tabletop paradigm. The idea, however, itself was such an alien concept to me, and I can say it had a lasting impact. Interesting as the idea is, however, it wouldn't have much punch at all if the philosophy wasn't delivered by characters that reflected the idea. And for that, I think perhaps Margaret Weis deserves much of the credit. She is the half of the writing team that excelled at writing dark characters. Wrestling flourished under her penmanship, and is such an iconic figure because of her. That, however, is a bit of foreshadowing, for he isn't quite as developed yet in Dragons of Autumn Twilight. The character or creature I would raise as an example of an evil character but portrayed in a wonderfully atypical way in this book is Matafleur. Matafleur is a red dragon, and anyone with even a passing knowledge of D&D concepts know that red dragons are stereotypically evil as gold dragons are stereotypically good. Yet Martha Fleur's actions in this book are hardly evil. Very few of us would consider a mother defending her children to be evil, I'm sure. But her act of what we normally consider good didn't come out of some redemption arc, which is how villains usually end up doing a heroic deed, like in Star Wars. No, Martha Fleur did what she did because she was bonkers and half blind, driven mad by the grief of outliving all her children, not just by decades, but centuries. Consider also that Martha Fleur pleaded with her children not to go off and fight in their long ago war. That is, in D&D terms, tantamount to sacrilege, a sin against her goddess. And in D&D, that often comes with real divine consequences. Of course, Martha Fleur wanted her children to remain with her out of selfishness, but it is a selfishness many of us, especially those with children, can probably understand. Martha Fleur's final flight touched me deeply when I first read it, and it continues to touch me after all these years. Quote, and as she had done so many centuries before, Martha Fleur flew out to defend her children. End quote. I don't know why, but that line always did bring a little bit of wetness to my eyes. That, I think, is the magic touch of Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, making evil relatable. The first book I read in this trilogy was actually the second book, The Dragons of Winternight. I then went on to read the final book of the trilogy before circling back to the first. It's probably an odd way to read the series, I admit, and it introduced me to a writing duo that I continued to follow for many years and across multiple series. And that probably is for the best. If my introduction to Dragonlance had been the Dragons of Autumn Twilight instead, I might very well have just chucked the series aside and never give it another look. Because good as the trilogy is as a whole, the Dragons of Autumn Twilight is pretty bad. In my opinion, the reason why it was bad had very much to do with the way it was written, with an actual set of players going through the adventure module and the events of the tabletop campaign written into book form. But I have spoken quite enough, and now I will open the floor to my co-hosts, and I am eager to hear their take. All right, guys. Which one of you wants to go first?
Pass the floor to Robert Gibson.
All right.
All right. I envy XJ his ability, and I'm not being sarcastic here, to read this narrative and to understand it much better than I could. I would like to be able to do that. Now, I've got 13 points to make about it, and unfortunately, they're not following straight off from the points XJ's been making. Ideally, they would, but in this particular case, my understanding isn't good enough. What I can contribute, though, is the reaction of a man of more average reading ability, which might actually help in people who are trying to write this sort of stuff to avoid some errors. Anyway, 10 negative points followed by 3 positive points, which I shall end with, which are quite substantial. All right. Now, these negative points, they're not taken individually. They're not that weighty, but they all mount up. First point, some of the names are too alike. Eben and Ember, Taz and Tanis. I noticed that very early on. Secondly, and following on from that, the names are too reminiscent of words with other meanings in our culture. Istar is too much like Ishtar, Magius is too much like Magus, Paladine is too much like Paladin, the moon Lunitari is too much like Luna, Draconian, the creature, is too much like the adjective Draconian. Verminard is, I think, the most ridiculous one, much too much like vermin. That one could come from Charles Dickens almost, with his stern magistrate called Mr. Fang in Oliver Twist. And it also reminds me of Stephen Donaldson's ridiculous Lord Fowl and Lord Drool. Third point, unfortunately, most of the time these authors have scant ear for prose. The Vallenwood trees in the valley. I mean, that's a disastrous alliteration.
Sorry, please go on.
swept their heads together with a sickening thud. Pretty dud cliche that. Swore beneath his breath, much pretty poor compared with swore under his breath, I would say. And inane sentences like he was feeling positively young again. Well, I think we could, touch that up a bit somehow. And there's plenty of paragraphs where I don't know exactly how the monotony of style is created, but it could be because there are lots of sentences of the more or less the same length. I won't give examples of that. Too many sentences ending in adverbs, cocking his head and listening closely, and he asked eagerly. I mean, all right, it's all right sometimes, but it can be overdone. Moving with a grace remarkable in such a large man instead of in so large a man. All these things mount up. Now, point number 4, slipshod or ignorant use of vocabulary and punctuation. Thee is in no position to ask questions. My impression is that it's the authors and not the characters who've got their thous and these mixed up. I could be wrong. I am Magi or Magi instead of I am a mage or I am a magus. Again, I do wonder if they know that Magi is plural. I hope they do. Crystal Mere Lake. I don't know if they know that a mere is a lake, so it's like saying Crystal Lake Lake. Pronoun confusion. There's a whole paragraph starting with flint, and flint is the subject of every word, every verb in the paragraph, and yet it suddenly says, and Flint's hands remained idle. Well, it's like, aren't we talking about Flint anyway? It's a bit confusing. Punctuation clumsy. The lines should be belonging to the previous paragraph. Sorry, to the next paragraph, and they're tacked onto the previous paragraph. Now, point number 5. Terminology is contrived or is striking the wrong note for heroic fantasy. High technocrat, cleric, inquisitions, maybe, but
What's wrong with cleric?
What's wrong with cleric? Well,
What's wrong with cleric?
What's wrong with cleric? It's
yeah. What's wrong with? You're just gonna repeat what I said to you. Yes. What's wrong with cleric?
I'm just amazed you don't see that it's the wrong atmosphere for this kind of literature.
You see this? Well, you'd think so, but
what about
unfortunately, like for someone who's never been in the sphere of playing Dungeons and Dragons, I get it. But cleric is a very commonly used word to describe a priest in the game. So it doesn't feel wrong to me, but I can understand how it could feel wrong to you.
I concede that point. What about this? I am Fewmaster Tood, leader of the forces that are keeping Solace protected from undesirable elements. You have no right to be walking in the city limits after dark. Not really the right kind of phrase for a work like this, I think. City limits and undesirable elements, but that might just be the way I look at it.
I mean, I agree with you with everything else. It's just I wanted to correct that one point because I think the viewers wouldn't get it.
Just to jump in, cleric is actually a class that players can play, so it's very integral to Dungeons and Dragons, and it would raise no eyebrows to D&D fans when they read the word cleric.
I'm sure.
Yeah, as I
said,
said,
that's true. Yeah. And what about this? Well, that's torn it, Tanis said grimly. I mean, and also some banal things like Kisanth gnawed a talon as she pondered. This dragon just gnawing its talon, like biting its nails. Anyway, now on to point number 6, which is wadges of information clumsily introduced. I can't resist quoting from another popular author here, just to show I'm not just picking on Weis and Hickman. Mary Higgins Clark, who died recently with lots of glowing reviews. This is the first 5 lines of one of her books. 30-year-old Elan Marsha Harmon walked briskly from her apartment on East 32nd Street in Manhattan to her job as an assistant interior decorator 15 blocks away in the Flatiron Building at 23rd Street and 5th Avenue in Manhattan.
The fact that you had enough breath to say that like you were reading it is commendable. On the other hand,
I commend myself for doing it. Anyway, I think that near the beginning of this Dragon Thingy book, the Inn of the Last Home and the town of Solace, the description of the inn and the town is jammed suddenly into the scene that's inside the inn itself, whereas it belongs more in an approach scene. And that's the kind of mistake which kind of puts me off quite early. It's better on the next page, page 7, when we get put into the description of the fireplace in the inn. A bin next to the side of the fire pit was stacked high with cordwood and logs brought down from the high mountains. No resident of Solace would consider burning the wood of their own great trees. Now that's good, but unfortunately, it's not all wisely positioned like that. Cramming of facts in as background. The high seekers in Haven appointed a man named Hederic to govern as high theocrat in Solace, and he's turned the town into a hotbed of fanaticism with his new religion. Well, I mean, do you sort of say something like that to an old friend you've just met after a long time? This dialogue between Flint and Tanis, page 13, it's a whole page of background cramming, which doesn't ring true to me. Although, admittedly, that the page does end on a well-written note. The sun sank, leaving the sky glowing a rich violet and causing night's shadows to creep through the forest trees. I wish it was all as good as that. And information overload. Good bit on page 182 here. The Queen of Darkness has returned. Recall words of the canticle, etc., etc. All very well, but who the heck is the Queen of Darkness and what the heck is the canticle? Sometimes instead of being shoved down your throat, the information is withheld far too long. What the heck was a gully dwarf is not explained for a long time. Until page 160, I think. Now, that little dig was point number 7. Point number 8, viewpoints are in the narrative are too often multiple and shifting from one character to another. Now, if that's done properly, it's a great achievement. And I would like to do it myself in my own writing. I haven't figured out how to do it yet, and I don't think these authors have either, but it hasn't stopped them from doing it. I think they're probably a bit too ambitious. Number 9, facile aspects of the plot. I think the healing
for the uneducated swine such as me, what the hell is facile or whatever you said?
Well, too easy, too perfunctory, too done without being thought out properly.
Repetitory, sort of like something that would happen in most fiction.
Well, the Healing of Riverwind by Goldmoon on page 149 is much too easy. Panis looked down at what should have been Riverwind's corpse. Instead, he saw the plainsman sit up. Well, that's a good trick, isn't it? As for Goldmoon's own return from death, page 215, I can't recall any explanation being given at all about this, though no doubt there is one.
I would like to just jump in onto that point, not to disagree with Robert. So, first of all, in D&D, clerical healing, like all that healing does take place in a fairly mundane fashion like that. You just heal and then people get up, and it's all a very mechanical thing with hit points and stuff. However, I agree with Robert that scene should have been treated with much more respect, because we're not just talking about a miraculous raising of the dead here, of a near dead guy here. We're talking about the return of the old faith to Kryn, which is a very, very fundamental part of the story. So the fact that he just kind of set up and then, well, that's I do agree with Robert here. It needed to have a more weighty treatment.
It's too easy. And my last negative point, number 10, is really to sum up the previous ones, is that all the faults of narration which I've outlined have the effect that it's hard, for me anyway, to concentrate and therefore hard to keep track of what is actually going on. And just one example, in chapter 18, which might otherwise not have been a bad chapter, the chapter with the pots and the lifts, by that time I just lost track of what was going on. Now, on to the positive. Some good writing certainly exists in the book. I'm going to give half a dozen examples which I thought were worth noting. Page 62, Tanis knew that though the knight held his head proudly, he was slogging through his own darkness. I like that, although the word slogging you might, but yeah, I like it. Page 83.
Damning with faint praise.
No, I do think it's good. Page 83. It wouldn't take the creatures long to find this new trail. Tanis glanced below him and blinked. There was no trail. There was nothing but thick, impenetrable forest. The trail had closed behind him. I thought that was really, really nightmarishly good. I like the bit on page 158 when Karaman and Tanis get Flint to come along with the rest by suggesting that since he's not coming, it'll have to be Sturm who keeps the Gully Dwarfs in line. But notice, though, that even then the Gully Dwarfs haven't been defined, although they soon are. A general point, for me, the tale came alive in chapter 21. The escape scenes gripped me when I read them through, though please don't ask me to define what was actually going on, because, I'd be hard put to summarize it all from memory. I think,
Sorry. Chapter 21, is that the Pax Taka scene, or is that in Slamory? The mines or the fortress with the final showdown?
Chapter 21. Hang on, I'm looking at the wrong book here.
Oh, you've got the same book as I.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Well, I can't remember. Hang on. Chapter, yeah, nearly there. Chapter 20.
Please wait.
Chapter 21, The Sacrifice, the Twice Dead City. All right.
City. Okay.
Well, anyway, I thought it was good while I was reading. I can't remember much about it, but I suspect that these authors are at their best in escape scenes. That seems to be what they do best. And also further on, there's another escape scene, which I thought was pretty good on page 250 to 250.
I'm sure you'd love to mimic the escape scene of escaping away from this book.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm looking so cheerful, because I finished it. Anyway.
Oh, no.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
I'm trying to be fair. Page 238, another good bit. Her face radiated a peace and calm serenity that made it seem as if the reptilian creatures on the outside of the cage were the true prisoners. I like that. A wise saying.
That was pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty good.
And my last good example of good writing, page 354, the last paragraph of chapter 14. Well, that whole paragraph is very good, but the last sentence ends is Lorana's spirit, released from its prison of fear, soared higher than the clouds, and her sword flashed in the morning sun. These people can write. It's just that usually they don't. Now, two more points. Big point in the book's favor, which XJ mentioned himself. The characters are good. They're interesting, especially Ray Stlin. And the dopey wizard Fizban, and the character of Goldmoon also, and her mixture of love and pride, I thought she's a good female character. Well, they're all good. Another virtue which I haven't actually enumerated, but I just want to put it in, is that the language is clean. Despite the authors being American, they seem to be able to do without the F word.
They weren't able to put any.
Yeah.
This is
Now,
a commercial book.
in conclusion, this pair can write, but most of the time they fall so far short of their best that their stuff is very hard for me to read anyway. I should think hard for anyone unless he happens to be an addict of that kind of genre.
Hmm. Well said, Robert. Well said. I applaud you. That was a great
Well
takedown.
delivered.
Yeah. All right, Nikki.
Yeah,
Tell us
so
how
I
terrible
mean,
the book is.
I'm gonna spend very little on the book. Actually, I'm gonna talk about stuff that actually is, I think, fascinating, which is the effect this thing had on the book, because on the thing that it came from, on Dungeons and Dragons. And first of all, I want everyone to understand that at least this is my personal opinion, my personal theory. I personally attribute the fact that this series, and if the first book is so popular, precisely because of its IP connection. Because until then, um, works of fiction um, that were associated with Dungeons and Dragons didn't have that kind of a mythos associated with it. Furthermore, uh, Tracy Hickman was very well loved as a creator of adventures within the Dungeons and Dragons sphere at the time. He was prolific alongside his wife, Laura Hickman, and they created a lot of things that were great, way better than this. Um, for example, some of you, probably most of you, have heard of something else that they created, which is Ravenloft, and have a really impressive setting of Dungeons and Dragons. For you to understand it rather quickly, Robert, so you're on the same page. They made a place like a interdimensional area in which a character that's basically Dracula rules the world. And what's so damn clever about the way they designed that whole adventure is that it can be used for any table, it can be used for any narrative. Because literally, the first thing that happens when you start the adventure is the servant of this Dracula-like character called, the guy's called Strahd, Lord Strahd. They find the adventuring party and they teleport them through these weird mists into the dimensional area. That meaning that whatever was going on in the story that you have been telling so far, it doesn't matter, because this adventure takes in this, confined space, and because of that, everyone would have exactly the same experience. This was groundbreaking. This was creating a story within the module for the dungeon master that they could use. While as beforehand, most adventures were like guidebooks, pencil books, so to speak, where you're basically given a bunch of things that are not that well connected, and it's up to you to connect the dots and make it enjoyable for your party, for the people that are playing, right? So this was prolific, and so they wanted to do more of that. And they decided that they were going to do what we now call cross promotion. We're going to create a set of adventures regarding Dragonlance, right? And we're also going to make a book alongside it. And the very first book that they did this with, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, they decided to write it after what has transpired during their beta testing, during the time that they were testing the adventure. So all of these characters that you saw, including Raceland, they're actually not creations of Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. They're creations of the players that played with them during beta testing.
No. The characters are pre-generated.
Yes, but they are pre-generated based from the beta players who played through the module.
Okay.
That's how they were created. And not only that, Tasselhoff is basically Frodo. The way the better player created them, he even had an invisible ring. So Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weis, when they got together, were like, we can't have a halfling, a hobbit, in our book who has an invisible ring. We have to change it. There's a mention of said ring when they start talking about it during the mine section, where Tasselhoff basically says, "Oh yeah, I had this magic ring. It used to," and then he gets interrupted, like as a little nod towards that situation. But to me, what's very impressive is that despite the fact that Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman had so much input from both the from both the company that was working with them and all of these better players who created personalities for these characters, and also they had this free reign to do whatever they want with the story, that it came up so misshapen in the end. And I think maybe that is actually the problem. Maybe they had too many cooks in trying to put this all together. Maybe they were trying to stay true to exactly what transpired during the beta game, right? Maybe they were trying to force in situations to make them work alongside a narrative within an actual book versus a D&D session. There's many possible reasons, and I can't speak to exactly why this book is what it is. But what I can tell you is it is a very true representation of a really mediocre Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And for that, I think it's actually unironically a piece of art. Preserving something that is very hard to put into words. Reading this is like reading notes of somebody who was really invested into this game they were playing with a bunch of their friends and decided to, put little quips into the narrative and try and sort of like cull it up together so that when the game was finished, he could give this to the dungeon master and say, "Here's all my notes. I, sort of messed around with them a little bit, gave it a bit more life, and the dungeon master would have loved that. He would have been, "Oh my god," right? Like, this is exactly what happened, in all of its clumsiness. But that's not why we read a book, right? Not to admire it. Like, when I go to an art museum, sure, I go there and I look at all the, paintings and I can admire them for the art they are, right? So just because I'm calling this a piece of art, please don't misunderstand me saying that it is something that I had enjoyed in the traditional sense of the word. I'm gonna come from afar on this point. My grandmother and mother, they have this fantastic way of relaxing that they have taught me over the years, and that is consuming bad media. So, what you do is you turn on a soap opera or a bad detective story, or you read one, and instead of focusing on the fact that it's bad, you just read through it as if you're washing your hair, right? You're sort of consuming it in a way where you're not paying attention to any of the flaws or even the narrative. You're sort of paying attention to the letters and just going through it to relax your brain. And I would very much recommend the first book of Dragonlance Chronicles as that. It's good, it's a good thing to wash your hair with, so to speak. It's not. It tries to be deep, but it's not. It tries to be interesting, but it's not. It tries to create this really epic narrative, but it fails. And it fails because that's what it's setting up to do. And it's so obvious that it's what it's trying to do. And it just can't focus. It's like it's like a person with ADHD. It keeps jumping from one idea to the other, which is exactly what happens during a mediocre D&D campaign, where plot lines get mushed together and then somehow the DM sort of like connects them. Like, the beginning of the story is these guys get together to find out about the old gods, right? And while that comes back later, with like elements that just kind of appear in front of the players, in front of the characters, but really, I mean, in front of these better characters, of the player characters. It's not really connected to the rest of the book, besides the fact that it is being referenced by story beats. In fact, none of these people really care. It doesn't seem like they act like they care sometimes, but then it sort of disappears into the back line, and then they're like, all right, now the story continues. It's like another comparison I would give it is during the 1940s and 1950s and 1930s boom of the cinema. In between movies or during the screenings of movies, there was a lot of serialized works that were being shown to people called, for example, Flash Gordon was probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous. Tarzan had like 60-something parts. Team O, and so on and so forth. There were hundreds of these serialized works, and they began with last time on Team O, or like last time on Flash Gordon, and it gave you like 30 seconds of what was going on, and then it would be like 40 minutes of narrative, and then it would say next time on Flash Gordon. Every chapter to me feels like that. Like this was put separately or written separately, and then it was sort of like connected through tissue, attempting to try and put a narrative together. What the master of the forest is probably the lowest low of this book. I don't understand why this person needs to be in this narrative, besides the fact that as literally a finger pointing to a point on the map is where you need to go, so that we can see more of the story. It's baffling that you would keep that in the book. It's understandable if you're running a mediocre Dungeons and Dragons, module adventure. Your players will forgive you. You have just so much to work with as a dungeon master because you have 5 other people who are messing with your plans. But this is a book. You have to do something. Make it make sense to me. Yeah. I was way more negative than I thought I would be. I just realized how much this actually irked me. But I will reiterate, this is a great study of what it's like to be in a D&D campaign, where the bar of the things you will forgive for the narrative is way, way lower. Because, you're there to have fun. You're there to drink a beer and slay a dragon. Here, there's a promise of narrative. There's a promise of something interesting going on. And the fact that some of the early copies of this book was like, this is the answer to Lord of the Rings. You don't have to wait no longer. Another epic. Like, I'm sorry, but how dare you? How dare you advertise it with those words? You gotta be so full of yourself to think that this is worthy of a quote like that. Whoever said that quote, I don't know who you are, but you should be ashamed of yourself. And TSR, I know you no longer exist as a company. I wonder why. You should be ashamed that you decided to take those words and put it on the cover of a book. But see, all of this doesn't matter, because this book sold really well, and it got a bunch of sequels, and it got a huge universe going, to the point where this book right here, Dragonlance, this is the latest adventure within
that, by the way,
within this universe.
the guy in the cover, by the way, is Lord Soth, another very iconic character in that universe.
Right, and he's really cool because he wears really cool armor. Anyway, so this book, by the way, because it's been so long after the creation of this thing right here, it is a cash-in on nostalgia. I've read most of it, and what it is basically the ability for the players and the dungeon master to be a part of the War of the Lands. But this time you don't get to be the cool characters who drive the force. You're just some dudes on the sideline. getting to experience War in the Lands on the other side of the conflict. And to me, that's hilarious. That this work can now claim nostalgia rights. That it gets a book where basically, for the lack of a better word, this is like, the company that owns Dungeons and Dragons masturbating over how great this is. That's what it is. Because all it does is it takes you through the narrative that's here. You're just less cool. You get to see the cool guys do the cool things. An absolute disaster. But I will say this. Dragonlance spawned a trend within the world of Dungeons and Dragons, within the universe, so to speak, that when we make adventures, we have to put more flavor in them. We have to put more interesting stuff in them. We have to put an actual narrative in them. And while this is an absolute failure, when it comes to putting a narrative that I could care about, personally, afterwards came so many much more interesting settings than Dragonlance. There was Dark Sun, which is basically a post-apocalyptic fantasy world where the wizards, the despoilers of that universe, created a massive desert out of the world that they existed upon, called Athos, and it's all about surviving in this horrible, bare bone existence. And there are books in Dark Sun that are set in that universe, and they are written so much better than this. It's insane, actually. You could just read the first chapter and you will be like, "Oh my god!"
It also, the fact that Gerald Brom is the cover artist for most of these Dark Sun books also helped quite a bit.
That's correct. Yes, Dark Sun is something that I would actually recommend reading because you can read it. This you can survive. I don't know about the second or the third book. I will be very honest, but apparently it was written in a way, as XJ also mentioned at the beginning. They were not written in this format where the first had to be a campaign. It was then retold into a book. The books came then first.
Yes,
but
Tracy Hickman later decided to stop the basing the book off the campaign or the module already. He decided to just continue writing the book. Otherwise, it becomes too episodic in his opinion. So, Dragons of Winternight is a straight sequel without the creation of the module.
So maybe it will be better. I don't know. I'm not sure if I will read it. I think it's very interesting that XJ started with the second book, with God saving him from the first. Perhaps it gets much better. But at this very moment, all I want to say is I would be very surprised if Dragonlance would have been a talking point for anybody if it wasn't a commercial book ordered by the company that then advertised it, had tie-in works alongside with it in a different media, and was pushed as the forefront of the TSR narrative at the time. I think if Dragonlance was written just as a book that just went on a shelf, I don't think it would have become a franchise. I mean, I don't think I've said anything positive about this work, have I?
No, there are some positive things about the tabletop nature of it, but yeah, no.
The one positive thing I will say about Dragonlance then is that the dwarf of the story, Flint, I think, he's dwarf enough, and he's funny because he's dwarvish. Like he's such a stereotype. Oh, like at first I was offended how stereotypical this dwarf is, being like, "Oh, I hate everything." You know, I gotta be gruff and grumbly, and I'm an old man, and I'm like 3 feet tall, and everything sucks. But deep down, I have a heart of gold. That offended me at first, because it's just like that's every single dwarf ever, right? You don't need to do anything with that. But then he became the most endearing part of the story for me, because I was like, oh, it's him again. Oh, what's he gonna say? Oh, it's another cliche of a dwarf. All right, that's kind of funny. So it went from being offensive to me to being so horrible that I actually started enjoying it. So yeah, he's my favorite character, Flint.
All right. Well, I'll just drop in a few words about the story itself, the book itself. I think for me, and I think this point dovetails with it, actually what both of you have said. Like, I think the story is very haphazard. It bounces all over the place. The companions travel to this point, to that point, to this point, to that point, and then back to Solace, and then out to some other place again. And I think that has something to do with the nature of the running the D&D campaign. Not only that, like, I will develop further the point Nikki made about the story. Like, honestly, sit down and ask yourself, to anyone who's read this, what actually is the plot of the story? First, you have the blue crystal stuff. Then you go to Saksarov to find the dish of Mishakal, either of which would have been like a proper book on its own. And then you travel to Qualinos to find out about Pax Takas, and then you go to Pax Takas. Like, what is going on? Writing the summary was a pain because I couldn't find a way to condense any of it into a cohesive thing for the podcast. And there's another thing that I really don't like about the Dragons of Autumn Twilight. And two things actually. One is, the first half of the book, the narrative is actually mostly driven through Tannis's point of view. I wonder if anyone noticed that. It's like Tannis telling us, reporting to us what everything is going on, and that dovetails with what Nikki said about somebody taking notes and then giving it to the dungeon master. Here, turn it into a book. I feel like the first half of the book, that's that. It only started picking up in around the Pax Takas area where they stopped doing that. And I don't know. In my mind, that could possibly be the time when they stopped the campaign. And they stopped the beta testing, and then the writers began to take off on their own because they no longer have material to base off on. And the other thing that really irked me, especially during that period where before Pax Takas, is how some of the characters would just have emotional reaction for no reason. And I think Riverwind takes the cake for having sudden PMS. Like, sometimes he gets really upset and then he has a quarrel with Gold Moon, and I have no idea why he became that way. Like, there is no setup to why he became offended by...
My headcanon is that the better player who was running one of those characters always ate the Doritos, and then the other person took it out on them during the game.
That's
what happened.
Could be. It was so weird. Like, sometimes Riverwind would just get upset with Gold Moon for no particular reason, and then Gold Moon has to go calm him down or whatever. It's like, dude, man, you are a man. Grow up. You're not a boy.
But they're young lovers. It's tumultuous time.
I am like, God damn it, man.
By the way, the fact that Riverwind, or whatever his name is, went in some place and stole a staff from a dragon, and that's like just brushed off. That's the catalyst of our story. Like, what? Can you please explain how any of this transpired?
It's like It's like what Robert said about the healing section. It should have been treated with a lot more weight and respect, you know. And River Wind is not the only character that just sinks into this PMS emotional drama, like tantrum. Sturm also did that quite a bit in the beginning. Like all of a sudden he would become melancholic, and you never understand why. You don't know why. He just suddenly becomes sad and brooding and grumpy and
Midlife crisis.
midlife crisis. Yes, he has severe midlife crisis. Absolutely. And you know the thing is sometimes like it's like in the beginning of the book he's portrayed one way, and then during the march he's suddenly turned into a different character altogether. Like in the inn when the brawl, the tavern brawl broke out, Sturm was like, he's like, no, I'm gonna sit right here. Sturm is a lawful good knight. He will never run from rebel a bunch of peasants, so he's gonna sit right there, and then when the peasants come, he's gonna kill them all, as if that's lawful good somehow. I don't know, but that was his scene in the tavern, in the inn, in the beginning. And then once they're in the outskirts, all of a sudden he's like, I'm grumpy, I'm sad, I'm melancholic. And you know the funny thing is, because I read the second book first, Sturm is actually my favorite character out of the whole series. Yeah, I don't know what to say, man. This Dragons of Autumn Twilight isn't a good book. Not a good story.
Now, let me take 5 minutes of your time to tell you how a story such as this could work in a campaign. Because I think not only is this like a bad book, but it's also a very mediocre D&D game. And I'll recount to you in 100 words or less, or probably a little bit more, a campaign that a friend of mine ran for me recently. And now, the idea of an all-out war going on in a kingdom is a pretty, it's a pretty easy narrative to get people into. And so this was also the case for the campaign that a friend of mine named Matthew ran for me. Hi, Matt. He called it Tyrant's Bane, a title that actually has a couple of meanings. So if you like played the game, but obviously none of you have. And the basic premise of it was our characters are from this town called Autumn's Rest, and we are trying to appease one of the sides of this conflict. And through doing that, through trying to appease one side, we anger the other. And they come in and they enslave our town. And that is at that point where our characters became these people on the run that were trying to find allies. And every time we came to one side of this conflict, they all seemed terrible. Just horrible people. And every single time we changed allegiances, we realized that the people we were with were pretty bad, but now we've exchanged it for something even worse. To the point where we were so traumatized as a party, we became evil. And we said, okay, that's enough. We are not joining no sides. We are our side, and we're gonna kill you all. And we played right into the dungeon master's hands, because that is exactly how he was designing the whole thing. Where narratively we are so antagonized that we become the antagonized group, the people who will be the antagonists. And it all ended with basically most of the armies being wiped out, and so was the capital. Oh, well, not the capital of the region that we were in. And most of our characters were dead. I was one of the survivors, as well as someone who was playing my sister. And what was so satisfying about it was, and this is not something you could replicate in a book, anytime that anything really epic or heroic happened, it wasn't a sure thing. Unlike in a narrative such as this, it's not a sure thing that something will transpire, because it's not written by an author, it's decided by the dice. And that's the beauty of Dungeons and Dragons. And that's why it was so fun to play through Tyrant's Bane and becoming the Tyrant's Bane by being the tyrants. But would it be a fantastical narrative as a book? If you worked with it, yes. But on its own, if a person would be reading it, they would be like, well, I can see this trope coming from a mile away, because obviously he's gonna jump to the chasm and he's gonna get a grip on it, or of course they're going to be able to revive this character, he's too important for the story. But that's not how it is when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, because that's not a sure thing. You could fail. And this story beat that may seem obvious in a worked narrative is not achievable in a game scenario. And when it is achieved, it feels like a miracle. And so to me, I think I would much rather play this mediocre campaign than read it. There you go. Those are my final thoughts.
So, Robert, do you have any final thoughts?
I fully agree. My final thought is I fully agree with your
What a
remarks.
rarity.
The movements in the story, the journeys, they were really random. It's like reading about Stonewall Jackson's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley in the American Civil War. He just marched here, there, and everywhere in order to confuse the enemy. And in this case, the people are marching here, there, and everywhere in order to confuse the reader, namely myself.
I think my final word on this would be that when you are basing something off, when you're trying to work a story that's been created in a certain media and you want to translate it into another media, you got to put in more effort than to just translate wholesale what was previously in the other media. Like books to movies usually don't work without a lot of writing.
Yeah.
Books to games don't really work without a lot of writing. Games to books or games to movies don't work either without a lot of work. Yeah, effort. Yeah. And I don't, I can't see how this would have been any different. And the fact that it was done in, I don't know, a bit disappointing, really, to be honest. I have to say, again, I don't know, but I feel like Pax Takas is where they stopped the campaign. Because there's a noticeable uptick, to me anyway, when Pax Takas rode around. But by then, I think most people would have been completely turned off by the beginning of the book. Anyway, yeah, I guess that's it. Do you want to go for a score?
I'll give it... Oh, go on, Robert.
I was going to say I'll give it 0.5 out of 10, I think.
That's the lowest score you have ever given. 0.5. Amazing.
I think I'll give it a 3 out of 10. The 2 points that I'm giving it that aren't putting it at 1 are, number 1, because it encaptures something that no other work has ever encaptured that I've seen, which is like a mediocre Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And so for that novelty, you know, it gets a point. And then the second point is for the fact that I liked Flint. Those are really the 2 things that I've got here. There you go, 3 out of 10.
Well, I'm giving it the same score as Nikki, primarily because I was saved by RNGs and read the second book instead of the first. Yeah, all right, man. that wraps up our discussion on Dragons of Autumn Twilight. We are trying to improve the podcast, and if you guys have anything that you want us to do or cover, or any titles to suggest that we cover, please put it down in the chat below. And I also have a bit. We also have a bit of a housekeeping announcement to make, which is that there will be no more uploads for a couple of weeks as we try to get some things done. So yeah, we'll see you in a few weeks. Until then, take care.
Thanks for tuning in.